So, first of all, thank you so much for joining Chris and I today at this, I guess, second of our webinar series. And we're talking about change management. For those of you who haven't met me, my name is Sean Mariasciani. I'm the sales executive here at Element AMS. And before everybody starts going, why is a salesperson going to talk about change management? What does he know? Um, I feel that change management has been a big passion of mine because my first nonprofit I worked for, I was thrown into change management. It turns out that the executive director, my boss's boss, was embezzling a bunch of funds from the organization. So very quickly, I became administering the database and learning about the operations of an organization and learning how to quickly adapt in a very fast changing environment. I also ran two national conductor artistic director searches for the Youth Orchestras of Prince William and for Bay Youth Orchestras. So with that, I'm going to pass things to Chris for him to introduce himself.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Maynard. I am a senior CIO consultant with Strategical Consultants. My background has been many years in the association and nonprofit space, primarily in professional associations, but I also spent a little bit of time in the K-12 charter school education space. Change management to me is a very close and important topic because not only in my current role from a consulting perspective, but throughout my career in leadership roles, change management has played a key factor, a key role in everything that we did, from, small changes to systems to full renew implementations to changing infrastructure within the IT area, et cetera. So I'm really excited to have this conversation today and talk a little bit about how I've approached it.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, we have a really heavy hitter on this webinar here. Chris wrote a book on change management. Chris, I kind of want to talk a little bit about that book, but what was interesting to me when I was, going through it was you wrote this book more well, geared toward associations, but I think the bigger question is, why did you write this book and who did you write it for?
Yeah. Yeah, I actually wrote it. I wrote it in the structure of a guide, right? So rather than, a lot of books on professional topics, you sit down and you start reading it, and suddenly it becomes a good sleeper book. But I kind of wrote this one so it's more of a guide. There's different components to, change management, and I broke the book up in 22 very specific components, where when you're having a challenge with one particular, aspect of change, you can go to the book and you can see, here's some approaches or some things that we need to think about as we're doing it. The reason I wrote the book is, inevitably change is something that needs to happen in organizations. It's a constant, occurrence. It's not something that you even do just one time. But I wrote the book because it's something that I focused on in my entire career is helping organizations to be better, and being better generally comes with change. And since I've been in the consulting space, it's a component of most of the associations and nonprofits that I've worked with that they haven't really done well with, right?
Mm.
So the book is a resource now that allows for organizations to be able to have something to help guide them through that. Of course, I like to help them through that also, but the book is a good starting point.
I love that you wrote it as a guide because, I feel like that's what the space was really needing is a little bit more of like a reference material, more reference materials, especially for something like that we're all dealing with, change management. You know, it's we're talking about the importance of this book, but I want to talk about how like it feels like organizations kind of are hesitant or there's a lot of trepidation around embracing change and managing it. So how, when you're working with these groups, how do organizations, embrace and manage change?
Well, I think that's, the crux of what you're saying there is that organizations don't do that very well.
Yeah.
And that's been my experience. I mean, I've been in organizations where they don't handle change very well, and and that's what I try to bring, to organizations is helping them with that. But yeah, it's an important piece. Organizations embracing change, it comes from the top, right? The very first component within my book is leadership commitment, and that's intentional. because if you don't have commitment from the leadership of the organization that, to embrace change, you're going to have a difficult time getting everyone underneath that leadership to accept the fact that change needs to happen also. And so really the leadership embracing it, the leadership championing it, that's what really helps organizations in that first step to move forward, in being able to look at what change do we need to do. Probably the best case scenario that I can throw out there, at least in my experience, has been, going to a new system, right? So whether it's a financial system or you're changing some other system within your organization, a lot of organizations go into that without thinking about change management, and it fails, right? We strategically have been brought into organizations because they had a failed implementation, because when they went through that, they went into it with, here's how I do it today. How's this going to, how can we do it like that in the new system, as opposed to looking at how can we make sure we get to the end result of what we're trying to get to in the most effective and efficient way for the system that we're putting in place, right? That's where your change management comes in play. That's only one component, right? There's communications, there's involvement with stakeholders, et cetera, right? But that's the first thing that has to be realized is, if we're doing something that's fundamentally a business change, how are we going to approach that from a change management perspective to ensure that we're doing it right?
Mm, I love that. I really like what you were saying earlier, though, and I kind of want to circle back on that with change coming from the top. Um,
Mm,
I've been, and, for the audience out there, Chris and I have been working on this webinar for a few weeks, and this weekend I was thinking a lot about, what that means and what it means to affect change from leadership. And maybe it's because of my music background and my, education background, but I'm thinking about the teacher, the conductor at the podium in an orchestra. They're waving a baton, they're putting forth what we call an ictus, or they're, pushing
mm,
forth that impulse of change, and the entire orchestra, whether it could be 1,000 people on stage, which, and in some cases, when I was with Virginia Arts Festival, we did Mahler Symphony of 1,000. It wasn't quite 1,000; it was like 450 people, but a lot of people on stage. It's impressive, and you feel this big wave of energy, and
yeah.
we call that entrainment, where a team is able to lock in. It's almost like they can move with, or you're like riding a wave of energy. And I feel that when I was thinking about this, a lot of times there's a failure in change is because there's probably either the leadership is fighting that energy and not putting forth the right, uh, ictus for energy or for change, or there's like a problem within the group and there's not that entrainment. So,
Yeah, for
there's
sure. And
oh,
and it's interesting because Moira actually just put a note, in the Q&A, which is, and she said, one of the biggest parts of change management is anticipating resistance. Absolutely, right? I mean, even from the top, if you have that top leadership buy-in, there is going to need to be this anticipation for resistance, because it's going to happen. It's very rare that you're in a situation where a decision is made to change on how you're doing something and somebody within the organization doesn't push back on it. So understanding that resistance will exist there, and then how do you approach that resistance? That makes it makes a big difference with it. One of the examples I can probably give you is, I've got a client, right now that uh, they're moving to a new AMS solution. Unfortunately, it's not Element, but they're moving to a new AMS system, and they were on a very, very heavily customized 800 plus customizations in their current AMS system, because we had buy-in from the top. We had the CEO and the COO of the organization saying, we are going into this project with the goal of no customizations and
mm,
changing how we fundamentally are going to do our business, our processes. Same end result to a degree, right? Some different, but to a degree. But we are going to do this. And that was a campaign that has happened over the course of the last year and a half during implementation, to make sure that we got to there. And we're about to go live in just a few weeks, and we still today have zero customizations in the new system. So that's the impact of approaching change management the right way, getting the right people involved, having the right conversations, getting the processes right so that you're achieving those needed results, but you know, making sure that everybody's on board and coming along on that journey also.
I love that. For me, and I say this, and unfortunately it's true in associations and, a lot of areas, you're most open to change when you're at rock bottom. And we
Mhm.
have change. I feel like the change management is really there so that an association doesn't have to go to rock bottom to really get the needed change and the needed like refresh into the way that they're operating, right? And in my experience, I'm sure you can agree, it's just a constant, it's not just a one and done, but it's a constant evolution, right? Because everything's constantly in flux. So, you know, when you're looking at that, you're looking at you come in and you're looking at a process or you're looking at an organization, what factors are you looking at? Like, is there a time where it's possible that, change isn't really needed? They are doing things right.
So, what you're talking about there is continuous improvement, which is one of the components that I address in my book, right?
I love that. Yeah.
You have to constantly be looking at it. So we're going to go live with this system, but then we're going to continue to evaluate that. You always want to be looking at, are we still doing it the right way? Is the way we're doing it the right way?
Mm,
Sometimes the answer is absolutely yes, we don't need to make any changes. But then other times it's like, well, wait a minute, by doing something a little bit differently, we now have the opportunity to be more efficient, be more effective, save time, save money, whatever the case may end up being, right? But it's something you always want to do. And I don't mean every single week looking at the same thing and saying it's still the right thing. Kind of the thermometer that I always put out there is at least annually and spread out throughout the year, but annually look at your processes and determine, is this really doing for us what we're trying to? Is the value add of that process still, at the same level that it was? Or is there a better way, of doing it? The other thing, I hope I don't pronounce this incorrectly, Jeline put into, the comments is, talking about risk tolerance and whatnot, determining that. But that's part of this whole continuous improvement is really looking at, we're doing it this way now and it seems to be working for us, but what risk is that creating potentially somewhere else in our process that we're not thinking about? That's why you want to always continually go back and look at how you're doing it and figure out, are there other ways to do it? Are there better things that we can do? What are those approaches, et cetera?
you're gonna forgive me for this one, but I'm a violist, not a violinist. So, perfection is something that we are, every musician is looking for perfection, but the viola, an instrument, it's an imperfect instrument. So I find that, the search for like the perfect organization, the perfect team, the perfect process is just kind of like, quixotic. There we go. It's quixotic where it's not really the best effort, right? It just I'm not saying go with MVP or the minimum viable process there and improving, but you got to start somewhere. For
Yep.
me, when I was director of operations, it was always like, all right, we did this audition round. How can we do it better? It was asking the parents, the participants, the kids, the conductors, really getting a holistic look at your processes like that and talking to those involved, because that's really and just like you're saying, it's not a every week looking at it. Oh yeah, check, that's done. That looks good. But just, a periodic. For us, it was once a year. But I feel like that's crucial to maintaining that
Yeah.
evolving process.
And I
So
think it's whenever there's a
yeah,
fun, whenever you're having a fundamental change in your organization also, right? So when I was the vice president of operations for Excel Schools, I called my, finance director, my IT director, and my, my facilities director and said, listen, we're getting ready to open up three more schools. We can't add that into our current processes the way that they are without people working, extensively long hours, so how are we going to make this more efficient? How are we going to be able to process everything coming out of these schools in a better, more effective way, so and that's what you do. You sit down and you start the conversation with what's the need, and then
right.
you start working on it from there. Yeah.
And I see Moira just put a question in the chat, and it really goes right into what I'm about to talk about the pain points of the that you see commonly. I'm sure that you see a lot of pain points. There's probably specific ones with associations, but is there like a threshold where that change is obviously too much for this group or too much for what they're really needing.
Yeah, yeah. Murray put it as when is change chaos, right? And that's exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, and that's something that there's a balance, right? You have to make sure that the change that you're making is not becoming an interrupter in your business, right? Or an interruption in your business. So it is important that when you're looking at your processes and whatnot, that you are measuring that. You're trying to make a determination of, does this change really make sense? Is it really going to add value to us? Or is it going to become a hindrance, right? Kind of a
Right.
blocker to, what it is that you're trying to get to. So it's just something that you have to look at as you're considering it also. And again, I mean, I think that, where most organizations fail is looking at change and change management when you're doing a
Yeah.
significant change in the organization as a whole, putting a new system in place or merging with another organization or bringing on a whole brand new business unit or program within your organization. That's when more often it fails than not. Generally, when when somebody recognizes that, hey, this is not working well for us, inherently change management kind of falls in place, right? Now, whether the different components that I address in my book or not are all addressed, that's a whole different thing. But that's the point where you start thinking about, how do we address this particular topic. But it's these big changes that are happening in organizations. That's really where, putting a focus specifically on, this is a significant change that's going to be happening, and we need to make sure that, one, we're communicating, we're disciplined about how we're doing it, we're bringing the right stakeholders along on the ride to help with
Yeah.
this, right? Part of change management success is buy-in. And the way you
Yeah.
get buy-in is you have them involved in the process. You get them on that pathway to help with it and whatnot. So,
And on top of, just building agency with your team, I think that's crucial when you're starting a big change, a big project, having that and talking to your team to give them agency and ownership in the project is also it's crucial for success. But I'm looking at Moira's question. She was asking how to avoid that. And this is something that I've thought about and struggled with myself. I'm coming back and you're gonna forgive me. So if I lose people, I'm going on way out in left field. I studied with, and I teach something called coordination technique, which is from a violist, Karen Tuttle, very famous. She taught my teacher and my teacher's teacher and a whole bunch of people. I was fortunate enough to play in a couple master classes before she passed. But when you're, bowing an instrument, her concept is something called repull. And repull is something that us violists, us musicians struggle with a lot because it's a very abstract concept. And it's basically the rebalancing of the hand in the middle of a bow stroke. So, there's also like, a neck or a back release involved in that. So when you're translating that to change management when managing a team, you're going through this process. Why are we going through straightforward? We're not changing anything. We're not doing any kind of rebalancing. Maybe like halfway through, maybe a third of the way through, re-evaluating those processes to see, hey, are we going in the right direction? Right?
yeah. I love that you're associating this conversation with the music side of you also, right? Because, what you're talking about is art. Well, change management is art also,
It
right?
is.
There's an art to this. And, Myra's got a very good question there is, how do you avoid that? And the way you avoid that is you make sure that you define what your measuring stick is, right?
Mm.
And if you're trying to make a specific change and the approach and conversation and the end results are going beyond what your measuring stick is, then you're
Mhm.
probably, going too far. So if you start out at the very beginning, defining what is the scope of what it is that we're looking at, and you live to that scope. Again, I've been
Yeah.
very successful with this with my clients of, before we start doing any work, we really spend a lot of time making sure that we've identified what we need to do, we detail out the scope of that work, and then we build a plan around the scope of that work. And then if it goes outside of the scope of that work, then we have to talk about what's the impacts of that, largely more overcome. Now, this is project management I'm talking about now more so
Yeah.
than, change management, but that's an important piece of it, right? Successful change relies on good project management also.
Absolutely. And you're gonna forgive me relating it back to music. It's my first thing, my first like field, but I really love what you said. It's an art because when you're playing an instrument, even it doesn't matter what instrument, I was having kids put a piece of wood up against their chin and then rub some like tree sap on horsetail and say, "Hey, make it sound beautiful," which to me is very abstract. So a lot of that was learning to talk in metaphors, learning to talk in very flowery, colorful language. So, taking the abstract and relating it to something that we do know is just something that is, I guess, has become second nature for me. But, you know, a lot of times when I've been in situations, you especially for you, you've come in and looked at or like as an outsider, looked at an organization's holistically, their process, and then you suggest changes, and then
Yeah.
afterwards, how do you make sure that those changes are really going to adhere and they're going to make the organization successful?
Yeah, evaluation and monitoring, right? I mean, it's like
Exactly what
when
you said. Yeah.
that that's the core of it. Once a change is in place and you're moving forward now, in the future you're going to continue to look at that, but evaluation and monitoring really becomes the measuring stick as to whether or not that change was successful. More often than not, it usually is if you've done your due diligence leading into the change, right? But I vastly have been involved in change that, man, we thought this was going to be great and it was going to add a lot of value, and it turned out not to be. And we learned that through monitoring it. We were
Mhm.
evaluating how the work was being done, and we had defined measures for looking at it, and it really wasn't successful. So what did we do? We immediately went into a new process to look at, okay, how do we fix this then? And fixing it wasn't necessarily we'll go back to do it the way that we were doing it. That's not
Right.
always the answer either, right?
No.
It's how do we readjust what we're doing so that it's being done better. Again, I think that part of that is it's you have to have the right stakeholders involved, with it when you're doing this evaluation and review of the change that happened. Get the right stakeholders involved. Make sure you have regular collaborative conversations with those stakeholders. Keep them in the journey. And usually, together, the group is going to come up with, well, what's the next step? Where do we go with this next?
Right.
Yeah.
Moira's fielding some questions, and I was saving them, or was going to save them for the end, but she's just hitting on some really basically. It's almost like she has a script in front of me. But
Yeah.
she was
I think
asking,
Moira's you're the beginning of her question. I
yeah,
do want to tap on this because I did kind of allude to it a
absolutely.
little bit ago. Is where have associations failed most often in change management? It's really in just being even just taking the time to look at what they're doing to figure out whether or not there's a better way to do it. That's probably the number one failure. And I think the number two failure, and I've seen this from clients that have engaged with us, is going through a significant change, but not really, applying change management principles, to that change. So not getting the right people involved, not collaborating, not having good communication, to the stakeholders who are going to be impacted by it. And then subsequently, you're ending up at the end with it not being, what you expected it was going to be.
Yeah. And another thing you said when you were talking about, reevaluating and evaluating during the project, I really like, and I kind of want to emphasize it. You hinted on it, and I just want to make it a little bit more direct. Tying the KPIs or what you're trying to accomplish with this change directly to, what change is happening. So if
Yeah.
you're measuring something completely different, that's not going to really give you any indicator if there is an improvement. And that's the trouble with associations. How do you really engage, do members like this new portal that we designed for them?
Yeah.
They like the way that we did it's really all about that KPI, that measuring stick that you're talking about. And uh, how do
Yeah. And
you,
you're touching on another area that I have
yeah.
some significant